The rain had started the way it always did in Atlanta in late October. Not gradually, not with polite warning, but all at once, like a decision that had been deliberated too long and finally made. By 4 in the afternoon, East Side was silver and blurred, and the gutters along Moreland Avenue ran fast with dark water that carried gas station cups and lottery tickets down toward the storm drain on the corner. Marcus Webb stood at the window of apartment 3C with a dish towel thrown over one shoulder, watching the rain come down. Behind him, the kitchen smelled of olive oil and onions, and a pot of chicken stock was murmuring softly on the stove. He had planned to make pasta. He had bought a can of crushed tomatoes, fresh garlic, and 2 handfuls of basil. A Thursday night meal, nothing special, nothing difficult. The kind of dinner he and Theo had 3 or 4 times a month, eaten at the small table by the window while Theo narrated cartoons he had already seen, and Marcus nodded along, half listening and wholly content. Theo was supposed to have been home by 3:30. Marcus checked his phone again. 3:58. He had sent one text, "Where you at, man?" and heard nothing back, which meant either Theo's phone was dead again or he had gotten distracted somewhere between school and home. Both were equally likely. Theo moved through the world at a pace that had nothing to do with urgency, pausing to examine everything. Sidewalk cracks shaped like rivers, pigeons with iridescent necks, the architecture of storm drains. His third-grade teacher had said at the last conference, with a kind of helpless admiration, "He notices things, Mr. Webb. He really, truly notices things." Marcus had smiled and said thank you and driven home thinking of Denise, because that was exactly how Denise had been. A woman who once made him pull over on I-20 because she had spotted a hawk sitting on a power line, and she needed a full minute to look at it. He was still thinking about her when he heard the footsteps on the stairs. Theo's particular stampede, which always sounded like more than one child, and the sound of the front door latch. He turned from the window and had already begun his prepared expression of parental sternness when the door opened and he saw that Theo was not alone. The boy came in first, dripping from the shoulders down, school backpack dark with water, sneakers squeaking. Behind him, stepping carefully over the threshold as though asking permission just by entering, was a woman. She was perhaps 50, or perhaps younger than that. It was hard to tell because exhaustion has a way of adding years that sleep can later take away. She was dressed well. A dark wool coat, black trousers with a sharp crease that the rain had now softened, low heels that clicked once on the tile before she stopped. Her hair was pulled back. Her makeup, whatever had been there this morning, had been mostly erased by the weather, leaving her looking oddly unguarded, the way people look when they have forgotten to put on the face they intended to show the world. She was carrying a small paper bag from Gentry's Market. She held it with both hands, close to her chest, like something to hold on to. "Bah!" Theo said, with the energy of a person making an announcement. "This is Miss Vivian. I met her at the store. She was standing by the soup cans for a really long time and she looked cold, and I thought maybe she should eat dinner with us because you always say soup is better when you share it." Marcus looked at his son. He looked at the woman. He looked back at his son. "Go get changed," he said. "You're soaked through." "But, Theo," the boy assessed his father's expression, determined that this was not a negotiable moment, and disappeared down the hallway. His bedroom door closed with a muffled thud. Marcus looked at the woman again. He was aware of the calculation happening in the back of his mind, the one he had learned to perform as a matter of habit, the tally of variables that told you whether a situation was safe, whether a stranger's presence in your home was a risk. It wasn't paranoia. It was the arithmetic of a man who had a child to protect and no partner to share the weight of protection with. But the woman in his doorway didn't look like a threat. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She looked like someone who had been standing in a grocery store for a very long time and hadn't been able to remember why she was there. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was low and even, with the kind of composure that comes not from calm, but from years of practice. "Your son is very persuasive. I tried to tell him it wasn't appropriate." "It's raining pretty hard," Marcus said. She paused. "It is." He looked at her for another moment, weighing something he couldn't have named. Then he stepped back from the doorway and said, I'm making tomato soup. There's enough. Her name was Vivian Holt. She offered this sitting at the kitchen table while Marcus stood at the stove, back to her, stirring the base. She didn't offer anything else. No last name context, no profession, no story. Just the name, simply. The way you give someone something small to hold while you decide how much more you're willing to share. Marcus Webb, he said without turning around. And you already met Theo. He introduced himself very formally, she said. He shook my hand. Yeah, he does that. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, facing the stove. His grandmother taught him. She said a firm handshake tells a person who you are before you even open your mouth. She sounds wise. She is. Very. He added the crushed tomatoes to the pot and watched the red bloom through the stock. She'd have something to say about me letting a stranger into my apartment in the rain, though. There was a pause. I understand if you'd rather I left. I didn't say that. He reached for the garlic. I said she'd have something to say, not that she'd be right. Theo came back in clean clothes, a gray sweatshirt with a cartoon dinosaur on the front, joggers, mismatched socks. He had towel-dried his hair into a kind of magnificent disorder and seemed completely unbothered by this. He pulled out the chair across from Vivian and sat down with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to make sitting down a performance. Do you like tomato soup? He asked her. I think I do, she said. I haven't had it in a while. Ba makes it from scratch. Well, almost from scratch. He uses the canned tomatoes, but he says that's fine because the tomatoes are already good before they go in the can. Theo looked at his father's back. Right, Ba? That's what I said, yeah. My mom used to make it with cream, Theo said matter-of-factly. But she's not here anymore, so now we make it the other way, which is also good. It's different, but it's still good. He reached across the table and straightened the salt shaker with great focus. Ba says that's kinda how things are. Different, but still good. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Marcus heard the pause from the stove and kept his eyes on the pot. That's a very thoughtful way to look at things, she said at last. Ba's thoughtful, Theo said, as though this were an observable fact like the color of the sky or the direction of the wind. They ate by the window, the three of them, with the rain still running down the glass and the yellow light of the kitchen lamp making the world outside look like a painting of itself rather than the real thing. Marcus had toasted bread, the end of a loaf, and put it on a plate between them. There was butter. There were soup bowls with the small chips on the rims that Marcus kept meaning to replace and never did. For the first 15 minutes, the conversation was mostly Theo. Theo reporting on the frog dissection they had almost done at school before two people fainted and the teacher decided to do it with a diagram instead. Theo asking Vivian what her favorite animal was, and then telling her at length why he thought manatees were underrated. Theo explaining with great authority that the best time to see lightning was from the third floor of a building because you were high enough to see it, but not high enough to get struck. Marcus didn't know if this last fact was true. He decided not to investigate it too closely. Vivian answered each of Theo's questions with the same careful attention. She didn't talk down to him, didn't deploy the particular sing-song patience that adults sometimes used with children as a way of avoiding real engagement. She listened. She considered. She gave answers that seemed to surprise even herself, as though Theo's questions had led her into rooms of herself she hadn't visited in a while. What do you do? Theo asked at some point. I work for a company, she said. What kind of company? She considered this. The kind that builds things, and helps other people build things. Like what Ba does? She looked at Marcus. He said nothing, eating his soup. Something like that, she said. After Theo had eaten and been pointed toward his bath with the promise of 30 minutes of television afterward, the kitchen grew quieter. Marcus cleared the bowls and Vivian stood to help, and they moved around each other in the small space with the awkward courtesy of two people who are not yet sure what they are to each other. You didn't have to do this, she said. You didn't have to come in, he said. We're even. She smiled at that, a real smile, the first one. The kind that took a person by surprise. It changed her face considerably. He's remarkable, she said. Your son. Yeah. Marcus dried his hands on the dish towel. He really is. She had picked up her coat from the hook by the door and was putting it on when she paused, looking at the wall beside the entrance. Pinned there, along with a school calendar and a printed emergency contact list and the takeout menu from the Thai place 2 blocks over, was a collection of Theo's drawings. Some were old, the paper gone slightly waxy with age. Others were recent. Most of them were drawings of people. Family, Marcus had assumed, or imagined family, or some blending of the two that existed only in Theo's specific inner geography. One drawing toward the center of the collection showed 3 figures around a table. A tall, dark figure, a small figure, and a third figure medium-sized, with what appeared to be carefully drawn wavy lines for hair. Above them, crayon lines of yellow indicated a lamp. At the bottom, in uneven letters, home. "That one's new," Marcus said from behind her. She turned. "He must have drawn it while I was at the stove," he said, "before you got here." She looked back at the drawing for a long moment. When she turned again, her eyes were bright. "Tell him thank you," she said quietly. "Tell him yourself," Marcus said. "He's 8, not asleep." He called down the hallway, and Theo appeared, toothbrush still in hand, foam at the corner of his mouth, and Vivian crouched down to his level and told him that his drawing was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a very long time. And Theo, completely unself-conscious, unpinned it from the wall and handed it to her. "Now it's yours," he said. "I already know what it looks like." Vivian pressed the drawing carefully flat against her chest, still crouching, and for a moment she was not a woman in a wool coat with chips in her composure. She was just a person who had been given something that mattered. "You have an extraordinary family," she said to Marcus, straightening. "We're working on it," he said. At the door, with rain on her coat and the drawing folded carefully inside her bag, she paused one more time. "You're raising something exceptional, Mr. Webb," she said. "I mean that." He nodded once. "Drive safe." He watched from the window as she moved through the rain toward a car parked at the curb. Dark, sleek, the kind of car that suggested a world well beyond East Side. He watched until the lights came on and the car pulled away. Behind him, Theo said, "Did she like the soup?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "I think she really did." Marcus had worked for Vantage Facility Solutions for 6 years. He knew the work the way you know a language you've spoken so long you no longer think about it, fluently, in the body rather than the mind. He could read a building the way other men read a newspaper, the way a pipe hummed when something was wrong downstream, the particular rattle of an HVAC unit running 3 degrees hotter than its calibration, the smell of old copper in water that had been sitting too long. He was good at his job. His supervisor, Ray Calloway, had told him this directly and without fanfare, which was the highest form of compliment Ray gave. On Friday morning, Marcus drove to the Holt Capitol Tower. It was one of his regular assignments. First and third Friday of each month, preventive maintenance on the climate control systems in the building's upper floors. He had been doing it for 4 years. He knew the security guards by name. He knew which elevators were slow, which coffee machine in the third-floor break room dispensed coffee that was actually worth drinking, and which of the administrative assistants on the executive floor left cookies in the break room at Thanksgiving. He had no particular feeling about the building. It was a building. It had systems that needed maintaining, and he maintained them. He parked in the service bay on Baker Street at 7:45, checked in with security, and took the service elevator to the 32nd floor. The executive level of Holt Capital Group was the kind of space designed to communicate effortlessness. All clean lines and muted color, the walls a warm gray that shifted in different lights, the furniture the sort that looked simple and was expensive. Glass panels separated offices from the central corridor. The carpet absorbed footsteps. On the walls at intervals, framed without commentary, were what appeared to be large-format photographs of people and communities, construction sites, schoolyards, community centers. Not quite advertising and not quite art, somewhere in between. Marcus was in the mechanical room behind the server infrastructure when he heard the corridor come alive. Voices, the brisk shuffle of people realigning themselves around a center of gravity. He had heard this pattern before. It meant someone important was moving through the floor. He came out to check the thermostat unit 3 feet down the corridor, tool bag in hand. He registered the group first. 5 people moving in a loose formation, tablets and folders, the particular velocity of a team that moved at the speed of a decision already made. And then he registered the person at the center of the formation. He knew her posture before he knew her face, the stillness of it, the held-back quality, like someone who had learned long ago how to take up exactly the right amount of space and not 1 inch more. He looked at the face. Vivian Holt. He looked at the name on the glass wall of the corner office they were approaching. Vivian Holt, Chief Executive Officer. He stood in the corridor with a pipe wrench in his hand and a tool bag over his shoulder and felt for a disorienting second like a man who had walked onto a stage in the middle of a play and discovered he didn't know his lines. She had already seen him. He knew because she had paused, a barely perceptible hesitation, a half step, and then continued walking. And there was a moment where she could have looked away and kept moving, and they could have both pretended that this corridor on the 32nd floor of the Holt Capitol Tower was not the same universe as a kitchen in a 3rd-floor apartment on Moreland Avenue. She didn't look away. She said something to the man on her left, low, brief, the sentence of someone making a decision, and he nodded and continued with the others toward the conference room at the end of the hall. She turned and walked back toward Marcus. "Mr. Webb," she said. He noticed, distantly, that 2 of the administrative staff were watching from the glass-walled workspace. He noticed the way she said his name, not with embarrassment, not with the particular discomfort of someone caught in a circumstance they hadn't planned for, but simply as a fact. "Ms. Holt," he said. "I didn't realize," she began. "Neither did I." They looked at each other for a moment. He was aware of what he looked like. Work clothes, tool bag, the marks of a different kind of mourning. He was aware of what she looked like, and what the name on the glass wall behind her meant. "Theo's drawing is on my desk," she said. "In my office." He hadn't expected that. He said nothing. "I meant what I said last night," she continued. Her voice had the same quality it had had in his kitchen. Controlled, but underneath the control, something real. "You've built something remarkable with that boy." "I'm still building it," he said. "I haven't finished." "No, but what's there already is—" She paused, searching for something. "It reminded me of things I'd stopped thinking about." He looked at her steadily. He had the careful, measuring way of a man who had learned not to spend words or trust too freely, not because he was cold, but because both of those things had cost him enough that he understood their value. "What kind of things?" "Why any of this is supposed to matter," she said, simply, without performance. "What it's all for." A silence opened between them. Down the hall, someone knocked on the conference room door and went in. The corridor was theirs, briefly. "The soup helped," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "The soup always helps," he said. "That's the point of soup." She almost laughed. He saw it, the quick brightness, quickly held back. "Do you have a moment? I know you're here to work, but I'd like, if you're willing, to tell you something. About why last night mattered as much as it did." Marcus looked down the corridor, then back at her. He set his tool bag down beside the wall. "I've got a few minutes," he said. They stood in the corridor rather than going into her office, which Marcus appreciated. It kept the conversation on equal ground. She told him, without preamble and without excessive emotion, that the past several years had been marked almost entirely by the company. The restructuring after 2020, the expansion into 3 new markets, the kind of institutional momentum that, once you were inside it, made everything outside it feel temporary and slightly unreal. She had meetings before breakfast and calls after midnight, and decisions that touched thousands of people. And she had told herself for years that this was exactly what she wanted, that meaning was in the scale, in the impact, in the numbers that represented not numbers, but lives. "But numbers stop looking like people after a while," she said, "if you're not careful." She looked down the corridor, not at him. I stopped being careful. He said nothing. He had learned that sometimes the most useful thing you could give a person was space to keep talking. I was standing in that grocery store last night for 40 minutes, she said. I wasn't shopping, I was just standing there. I couldn't remember the last time I had eaten a meal that wasn't at a work event or by myself over a laptop. I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked me a question that wasn't about the quarter or the portfolio or the board meeting. She paused. And then this 8-year-old walked up and asked me if I liked tomato soup. Marcus exhaled through his nose. You gave me dinner, she said. You didn't have to. You didn't know me. And it wasn't... She chose her words. It wasn't pity. That's the thing. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't policy, and it wasn't strategy. It was just dinner. Because your son thought I looked cold. He does that, Marcus said. He sees people. He does. She looked at him. Where did he learn it? Marcus considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things. His mother, partly. She was like that too. And partly, he paused. I think some people are just born that way. They come into the world already paying attention. Vivian nodded. Something in her settled. I have a meeting, she said. But I'd like to talk to you again, if you're willing. She said it the same way she had said everything, directly, without softening it into a request it wasn't. There's a project. It's been on paper for almost a year, and I keep finding reasons not to move it forward. And last night I thought, what I'm missing is someone who knows what I don't. What do you know? Marcus asked, not as a challenge, as a real question. Scale, she said. Capital, systems, how to build something that lasts. And what don't you know? She met his eyes. What it actually feels like to need it. In the weeks that followed, Marcus did not change. This was important. He was still the man who woke at 5:30 to pack Theo's lunch before his own shower, who fixed the Hendersons' leaking faucet on the second floor because Ray next door had a bad knee and couldn't manage the stairs, who kept a photograph of Denise on the shelf above the kitchen sink because he wanted to see her face while he did ordinary things. He was still a man who drove a 2017 Civic with a cracked dashboard that he planned to fix sometime in the next year or so. But he began to understand that his life had unexpectedly acquired a new dimension. Not a larger life, not a different one, but the same life with something added to it that he hadn't anticipated and hadn't planned for. He met with Vivian twice in the first week. Once at a coffee shop on Edgewood that was neutral ground, once at the Vantage office building where he worked, which was not neutral ground at all, but which she came to anyway, without fanfare, carrying coffee for both of them in paper cups from the cart outside. She told him about Project Hearthstone. It had begun 2 years ago as an internal proposal, a community investment initiative designed to provide structural support for single-parent families in Atlanta's underserved neighborhoods. Housing assistance, childcare subsidies, job skill development, after-school programming. The kind of initiative that looked good in an annual report and had the potential to be genuinely transformative if executed by someone who understood what genuinely transformative looked like from the inside. It's been sitting in approvals for 14 months, she said. I keep signing off on delays. I tell myself it's because the model isn't right yet. But the truth is, she turned her coffee cup in her hands, I don't trust myself to know what right looks like, because I've never been in it. I can model the economics. I can project the outcomes. But I can't tell you whether what we're designing would actually feel like help to the people it's meant for. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Outside the coffee shop window, Edgewood Avenue moved through its mid-morning rhythms. A woman with a stroller, a delivery truck double-parked, 2 men in paint-spattered clothes sitting on a brick wall with sandwiches. There's a difference, he said eventually, between something designed to address a problem and something designed by someone who has the problem. Vivian looked at him. When Theo got sick in 2nd grade, ear infection, ran 3 days without me knowing because I thought it was just him being tired. I took him to the clinic on Boulevard because it was the closest. The waiting time was 4 hours. I had already called in for the morning, but I was hourly, and I knew I'd lose half a day's pay sitting there. He paused. I sat there anyway. I sat there 4 hours, and then they gave us antibiotics, and it cleared up in 3 days, and it was fine. But there's a version of that story where I don't sit there, where I tell myself it'll clear on its own because I can't afford the time. And sometimes it clears on its own. He looked at her steadily. And sometimes it doesn't. Vivian had stopped turning her coffee cup. That's the gap you're talking about, he said. The difference between the model and the actual person making the decision at 7 in the morning when they're already late and already tired and already doing math on a situation where there is no good answer. Yes, she said. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So you want me to, what, consult? Tell you where your model's wrong? I want you to build it with me, she said. Not for me, not as an advisor I can point to in a presentation. With me. She paused. I know that's not a small ask. I know what it would mean in terms of your time, your schedule. I'm not asking you to give anything up. I'm asking if you'd be willing to add something. Marcus looked at her for a long time. The coffee shop moved around them, indifferent. He thought about Denise. He thought about the way she had said once that the best things in her life had always been the ones she hadn't planned, the ones that showed up without asking, that ask you to respond rather than to prepare. He thought about standing at a window in the rain, watching a dark car drive away, and feeling something he hadn't been able to name. I'll think about it, he said. That evening he put Theo to bed and then sat for a while at the kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold beside him. He looked at Denise's photograph on the shelf. He looked at the wall where Theo's drawings were pinned. The collection had a gap in it now, where the drawing of 3 people around a table had been. He called his mother. She picked up on the second ring, which she always did, as though she had been expecting him. Something's on your mind, she said. She didn't phrase it as a question. Something is, he agreed. He told her about the offer. He told her about Vivian Holt and the project and what it would mean. He told her about the coffee shop conversation and the things he had said about the clinic on Boulevard and the 4-hour wait. His mother was quiet for a moment. You think it's charity, she said. Part of me does. Which part? He thought about it. The part that's used to being the one who manages, not the one who gets managed. There's a difference, his mother said, between someone offering you charity and someone recognizing that you know something they don't and asking you to share it. I know that intellectually, but it's easier to see in other people. His mother made a sound, part laugh, part acknowledgement, that he had known all his life. Your son invited a stranger to dinner, she said, because he thought she needed it. He didn't ask your permission first. No, Marcus said. He didn't. He was right, though. Yeah. Marcus looked at the shelf, at Denise. He was. Then maybe you ought to trust the same instinct in yourself, his mother said. You've earned the right to be in that room, Marcus. You earned it the way that woman with all her money hasn't. The hard way, the real way. Don't walk away from the room because you're worried about what walking into it looks like. He was quiet. And tell Theo I said he's wasted on the 3rd grade, she added. That boy should be running something. He laughed, and the kitchen felt lighter after it. He called Vivian the next morning and told her yes. There were conditions. He was clear about them, not because he was testing her, but because he needed her to understand what kind of participation she was asking for. He couldn't take meetings during school hours unless they were scheduled well in advance. He wouldn't reduce his hours at Vantage, at least not in the beginning, because he needed the stability, and he needed the benefits, and those were not things he was willing to risk on a project that was still finding its shape. He would tell her when the model was wrong. He would not tell her what she wanted to hear. He would not be managed. She agreed to every condition without negotiating. He had half expected pushback on at least one of them, but there was none. She simply said, "All right," and he realized that this, the straightforwardness of it, the absence of performance, was what he had been responding to since the night in his kitchen. She said what she meant. He said what he meant. The space between those two facts was where the work would have to happen. Over the following month, Marcus sat in rooms he had never been in before. Conference rooms on the 32nd floor, development meetings in a smaller space down the hall that someone called the War Room, but which mostly smelled of whiteboard markers. He listened more than he spoke in the beginning. He watched the way the team operated, the language they used, the metrics they returned to again and again, the particular blind spots that appeared whenever someone used the phrase target demographic as a way of not saying people I don't actually know. When he spoke precisely. He said, "The gap between when rent is due and when the check arrives is 5 days, and 5 days is long enough for a family to fall apart." He said, "Childcare wait lists in the neighborhoods you're targeting are between 8 and 14 months, which means any workforce development program you build that doesn't include parallel childcare infrastructure is a program you're designing to fail." He said, "Trust has to be built in the community before you build the building, because the building means nothing to people who have watched buildings go up and been displaced by them." They wrote this down. All of it. There was a woman on the development team named Priya who had grown up in Decatur and understood what Marcus was saying at a level that went beyond professional empathy, and the two of them became, without announcement, the project's reality check. When a proposal came through the group that looked good on paper and felt wrong, Marcus and Priya would find each other's eyes across the table. "It's the gap again," she'd say. "It's always the gap," he'd say. Vivian watched these exchanges without comment, but she adjusted the proposals. There were days when Marcus drove home from a 32nd floor meeting and sat in the parking structure for a few minutes before getting out of the car, turning something over in his mind. Not doubt, or not only doubt. More like the adjustment a person makes when something they thought was fixed turns out to be movable. He had not thought of himself as someone with institutional access. He had not thought of himself as someone whose specific knowledge had a place in rooms where decisions were made about systems and resources. He had known, in the abstract, that his experience had value. But there is a distance between knowing that in the abstract and having a woman who runs a multi-billion-dollar company stop her whole meeting to write down what you said about a 5-day rent gap. He mentioned this to Theo one evening, not the specifics, just the shape of it. That sometimes people learn things the hard way, and that learning the hard way, though it costs you, also gives you something. Theo listened with the focused attention he brought to things that seemed important to him. Then he said, "So it's like when I fell off my bike, but then I learned how to balance better." "Yeah," Marcus said, "exactly like that." "So the falling was worth it." "The falling was worth it." Theo nodded, satisfied, and went back to his homework. 6 weeks into the project, Vivian came to Eastside. She had called the day before to ask if she could see the neighborhood, not for research, or not only for research, but because she wanted to understand the geography that the project was meant to serve. She had grown up in Buckhead, gone to school in Washington, D.C., worked in Atlanta for 12 years, and never spent meaningful time east of the Beltline. Marcus drove her around for an hour on a Saturday morning while Theo was at his grandmother's. He showed her the clinic on Boulevard. He showed her the school where Theo went, the community garden 2 blocks over that had been planted on a vacant lot, and that the neighborhood had kept alive through 3 cycles of neglect and redevelopment. He showed her the hardware store where the owner, a man named Earl, who had been there since Marcus was in high school, kept a bulletin board at the back with handwritten cards. People looking for work, people offering services, the quiet economy of people who didn't have apps for this. "He's been doing that bulletin board for 30 years, Marcus said. "People find work through that board. People find apartments. People find childcare." He paused. "That's infrastructure. It just doesn't look like infrastructure." Vivian stood in front of the bulletin board for a long time, reading the handwritten cards. "This is what I mean," she said finally. "When I say I don't know what it looks like, this is exactly what I mean." "Now you know what it looks like," Marcus said. She took photographs of the board. She didn't take photographs of anything else. Not the clinic, not the school, not the streets. She understood, he thought, that some things couldn't be documented without distorting them, and that the board was different because the board was made of words, and words could be carried back. It was Theo's idea to have her over for dinner again. He had been asking for weeks. Not pressingly, not with the kind of insistence that required management, but with the patient regularity of someone who understood that some things simply needed to be asked enough times. "Is Miss Vivian coming for soup again?" he would inquire occasionally, in the calm tone of someone checking on a plan that was moving forward at an appropriate pace. Marcus had not answered directly. He had said maybe and we'll see, and once, memorably, "You're something else, you know that?" To which Theo had said, "I know," without the slightest self-consciousness. The dinner happened on a Friday evening in early December, when Atlanta had finally arrived at the version of cold it permitted itself. Not bitter, not punishing, but enough to justify turning on the heat and making something warm. Marcus made the tomato soup again. He also made cornbread this time, from the recipe his mother had given him when he had first lived alone. The one with the cast-iron skillet and the little bit of honey that was technically his grandmother's amendment to the original. Vivian arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine for the adults and, because she had somehow acquired intelligence about this, a set of 3 small model cars for Theo, the kind with the real metal doors that opened. Theo received these with the studied composure of someone who is very pleased but is working on being gracious about it, and then completely abandoned the composure and said, "These are so cool," with his whole body. They ate. The cornbread sat in the center of the table and they tore pieces from it while the rain moved against the window. Not the same kind of rain as the first night, not the sudden October kind, but the quieter, steadier December variety that felt less like an event and more like a condition. The kitchen lamp made its yellow light. The soup steamed in the bowls. Vivian and Marcus talked about the project, the parts that were working and the parts that needed rethinking, a proposed partnership with 2 neighborhood organizations that Marcus had been cultivating for the past 3 weeks, a funding timeline that Priya had revised twice. Theo listened to this conversation with the expression he wore when adults were discussing something that he didn't fully understand, but that struck him as important. The same expression he wore during the news and during the longer church services his grandmother took him to. At some point, without announcement, he got up and went to his room. He came back with his sketchbook. He sat back down and opened it and began to draw, with the unself-conscious industry of a child who draws the way other people breathe, because they can't not. Marcus refilled the soup bowls. Vivian asked him about Denise gently, and he told her, not the whole story, not that night, but the shape of it, the arc. A woman who noticed hawks on power lines and made tomato soup with cream and taught her son to shake hands like he meant it. A loss that had left a space that nothing was intended to fill, only to exist beside. Vivian listened the way she listened to everything, with the full weight of her attention, without reaching to fix or to soften. "She sounds like she was remarkable," she said. "She was the kind of person who made ordinary days feel like they mattered," Marcus said. "I think that might be the best thing a person can be." Vivian looked across the table at Theo, bent over his sketchbook, lower lip caught between his teeth. "He got that from her," she said. "He got it from her," Marcus agreed, "and then he kept it." After the dishes were done and the cornbread was reduced to crumbs and the wine was most of the way gone, Theo brought his sketchbook to the table and opened it to the page he had been working on. He had drawn the 3 of them. Himself, small, recognizable by the cartoon dinosaur on the sweatshirt he had apparently decided to include. Marcus, tall, with the dish towel over one shoulder. And Vivian, at her place at the table, the wavy hairlines he had used from the first drawing. Above them, the yellow lamp lines. At the bottom of the page, in the letters that were getting more even every week, "Still home." He pushed the sketchbook across the table toward them. "I put still because it's the same as the first one," he explained, "but also because it keeps being home, like it doesn't stop." Marcus looked at the drawing for a long time. Vivian looked at it too. Neither of them said anything, which was the right response, the one the moment required. Then Marcus said, "That's good thinking, Theo." "I know," said Theo, pulling the sketchbook back and closing it. "Can I have the last piece of cornbread?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "You can have the last piece." Later, after Theo was asleep, after Vivian had gone, After Marcus had washed the last of the bowls and turned off the kitchen light, he stood for a moment at the window. The rain had stopped. East Side lay quiet and wet under the street lamps, and here and there a light was on in a window, and from somewhere down the block someone was playing music low enough that it was more a feeling than a sound. He thought about what his mother had said. "You've earned the right to be in that room." And he thought about what Theo had said. "It doesn't stop." And he thought about what he had said himself once, in a coffee shop on Edgewood, to a woman who had been standing in a grocery store for 40 minutes. The soup always helps. That's the point of soup. The point of soup. The point of a dish towel over your shoulder and a pot on the stove, and the kind of warmth you can make from very simple ingredients, provided you pay attention and you don't rush it, and you understand that the thing you're making is not really about the soup at all. It was about the table. It was always about the table. Marcus turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. In the morning, there would be lunches to pack, and a drive to make, and a meeting on the 32nd floor that he had things to say in. There would be cornbread crumbs to sweep from the counter, and a sketchbook to put back on Theo's shelf, and model cars to retrieve from under the couch where they had inevitably migrated. There would be all of that. There always was. But for tonight, for this moment at the window with the wet street below and the quiet above, Marcus Webb allowed himself to feel the specific contentment of a man who has not solved everything, who never will solve everything, who was not fool enough to think that contentment meant the absence of hardship, but who has found, in the ruins of the life he thought he was building, the outlines of a life worth building instead. He thought of Theo, asleep down the hall. He thought of a hawk on a power line. He thought, different, but still good. Outside, the city went on being itself, wide and complicated and occasionally careless with the people in it, as cities are. But in a third-floor apartment on Moreland Avenue, 3 people had found each other at a table, and that table was still standing, and would be. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything.